A few days ago, I talked about my chatterbait rod, reel, and line, and I asked you guys if you wanted to hear about more lures, specific lures to tackle that I use. A lot of you said yes, that you did. So I'm gonna continue on with this series. Today, I'm gonna talk about the best spinnerbait rod. And it's not just a spinnerbait rod, although I primarily use it for spinnerbaits. I also use it for buzzbaits and a little bit with jigs. And we're gonna talk all about that rod in just a minute. Now, before I get into that video, it is brought to you by my apparel company, Finn Fishing. Today is the very last day to take advantage of the Independence Day sale, where basically everything on the website, except for the rod and gloves, are 20% off. So you can get USA made sun shirts 20% off, you can get hats 20% off, you can get sun gloves, t-shirts, whatever it may be, all at 20% off. Today is the last day, so if you want to take advantage of this deal, click those links down below in the description. Shopping at Finn Fishing is truly the best way to help support this channel, and I greatly appreciate it. All right, let's talk about the rod, reel, and line when it comes to specifically spinnerbaits, buzzbaits, and a little bit of jigs. As you can see, there's a jig on here right now, and I'll talk about that here in just a moment. But over the years, I have found that this particular rod and reel setup and the length of this rod and the action of this rod, the reel, everything is the perfect setup for both spinnerbaits and buzzbaits. This is what I use literally 99% of the time when it comes to those two lures. So let's go ahead and go through it. Now, the rod is actually a rod that is an ARC Tharp Series Cobb rod. This is only a $99 rod. So a great rod, and it looks cool, but it's not that expensive when it comes to like really high-end rods, but it has a lot of high-end components on it, and that's the ARC Cobb Series rod. Now, this particular rod is the Buzz Burner rod. This rod was designed by Brandon Cobb to be a buzzbait rod, and it is a great buzzbait rod. It is a 7-foot 1-inch fast action rod. It is a heavy power rod. That's very, very important to understand. It's actually a heavy power versus a medium heavy, which I throw a lot of medium heavies. Now, the reason that I like a heavy power rod when it comes to fishing spinnerbaits and buzzbaits, specifically spinnerbaits, is that there are a lot of times where I will use really big spinnerbaits. I'm talking 1 ounce spinnerbaits, you know, maybe even a little bit bigger. And this particular rod is rated for a 1 ounce spinnerbait. In the springtime, sometimes I'm using a 3/4 ounce, I'm slow rolling it. In the summertime, I'm using a real heavy one, either burning it or dragging it across the bottom. So I actually like to have a little bit of a heavy power rod when it comes to a lot of the spinnerbait fishing that I do, because I want it to be a good rod for those top end heavy spinnerbaits. Now, with that being said, this is a very light rod, so it can also manage your really small spinnerbaits, 1/4 ounce spinnerbaits, 3/8 ounce spinnerbaits very, very well. Now, this is a fast action rod, so that means that it's going to have the majority of the bend in this rod at the tip of the rod. It's kind of more of your traditional 80-20 rod, which I really like with spinnerbaits, because you want to have some good backbone. Same thing with buzzbaits. You want to have some good backbone to be able to drive that hook into the fish, but that tip, having that softer tip, really allows you to place a bait and cast extremely accurate. And I didn't realize just how important that softer tip was until I started, like back in the day, I messed around with using some rods that didn't have as soft as a tip. They were a little bit more broomsticky, if that makes sense. And your casting ability goes way off if you have a very stiff rod. So I really like to have that fast action rod. I think that that's perfect for both spinnerbaits and buzzbaits. Now, another thing that's really important about this rod that I like is the length. 7-foot 1-inch. I think that that is the perfect all-around length. You know, sometimes I wouldn't mind, you know, if I'm using those really big spinnerbaits in the, you know, like out on the ledge, sometimes I'll actually use a different rod at times if I'm solely using that. But this rod, I've done a lot of that with. Sometimes I like a longer rod, really, a 7'4", 7'6". And then there's been years and years where I've liked really short rods, 6'6" to 6'9" rods when I'm like fishing a spinnerbait around cover. So that's why I like this 7-foot 1-inch rod. It's really just a perfect blend to be able to do all your spinnerbait and buzzbaits with. You can make tight casts, you can make long casts, it is a great, great rod. Now, with that being said, let's talk about the reel. The reel is the next probably most important component. And this reel right here is actually, it's an Art Gravity 5 reel, but this is a 7.1 to 1 gear ratio reel. I really like the 7.1 to 1 gear ratios. I do not like anything faster than that. This is probably the top end speed that I will throw most of my spinner baits with, because there are days, you know, where I really want to slow roll that spinner bait. And even with the 7 to 1, it can be a little bit difficult. But if you're not the guy who wants to constantly change reels out for like specific techniques or specific lures even, then that 7.1 to 1 is really perfect. I also like this reel because in the summer when I'm throwing a spinner bait or a buzz bait and I'm ripping that thing pretty fast, I still have some good speed there where I can make a very long cast and retrieve it very quickly. So to me, that 7.1, anything kind of within a half step up and down of that is kind of where I like to live. But really, I guess you can say that this is the fastest I would really like to go with my reels. Now let's talk about line, because the line is the biggest difference in these particular setups that I'm going to use when it comes to spinner baits and buzz baits. When it comes to spinner baits, I use 20-pound fluorocarbon all the time. 20-pound fluoro it's very much like my chatterbait fishing. I use 20-pound because it doesn't affect that bait at all. I fish a spinner bait a lot around heavy cover, docks, laydowns, stumps, heavy grass even. So I want to have some thick line. If I hook into a 6-7 pounder around heavy cover, you're gonna want that 20-pound line. Now on the flip side, I used to use 20-pound fluorocarbon a lot with my buzz baits, and I like that. I don't mind that at all. But over the years, I've started to go to braid, to straight braid. And I like a 30 or 40-pound straight braid with my buzz baits. Now that has nothing to do with braid floating versus fluorocarbon, because it doesn't matter with a buzzbait. A buzzbait, you're constantly reeling. So you can use fluorocarbon with that. I wouldn't really suggest mono, even though you could do it and get away with it. But I do like to have braid. Now the biggest thing specifically for me is that when I switch over to buzzbaits with this exact same rod, I do not want to set the hook the same way that I set the hook with a spinnerbait, because I don't want to overpower that fish. You know, because I'm not changing my rod, I really don't need to set the hook that hard when I'm using straight braid, because there's no stretch in that line. So you just got to really kind of understand who you are as a person and how you set the hook. If you start losing a lot of fish with this setup with braided line, don't set the hook as hard. You'll probably not lose as many, because a lot of times with braid, I mean, you literally just, they hit it and you just kind of pull back and you got them, especially with a sharp hook on pretty much buzz baits that there are these days. Now with the fluorocarbon and a spinnerbait, I jack them pretty hard. Now, last thing I want to talk about is the jig. Obviously I have a jig on here. I haven't really talked about jigs, but to me, this has actually become my favorite jig skipping rod. I really like to fish jigs primarily on longer rods, like 7'3" and 7'6" rods. But if I'm specifically skipping a jig, for example, if I'm dock fishing, this buzz burner rod right here is a perfect setup for skipping a jig. You could go a little bit smaller, but I like to have the leverage of a little bit longer rod, that's 7'1". To me, this is perfect. That was the last thing that I was actually doing with this rod, was I was skipping it underneath docks. That's why there's a jig on it. And it worked perfect. Basically, it's your exact same, you know, spinnerbait combo. 20-pound line, your 7.1 to 1 gear ratio, and that rod. So a jig is really good when I'm skipping it. If I'm using a jig in other ways, I typically use a little bit longer rod, but when I'm skipping a jig, this is the rod that I go with. All right, guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope I didn't leave anything out. If you, again, if you like these series, let me know down below. I will continue to do them. Next up will probably be my actual jig rod, since we talked about it a little bit here. But anyways, thanks guys for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.